to be well worth your time. My name is Lenore Barrientos, and I am the NAMI Valley of the Sun Board President. And it's truly an honor for me to be able to introduce Natalie Summit, our guest speaker for this evening, and also for next Thursday. Natalie is a steadfast, devoted, very thoughtful volunteer for our affiliate. And over many years, she has volunteered doing a variety of things, all extremely valuable. For the last 5 years, she has served on our board of directors. And it's been my pleasure to get to know Natalie, being on the board with her. And I can tell you that she has definitely been a stellar board member. And anytime she's asked to do something, if she says she'll do it, she does it to the best of her ability. And that's always great. In serving on the board for 5 years, I would have to say that Natalie, and getting to know her, which is my distinct pleasure, she's a living example of our mission, which is to support those living with mental illness and their families. She's a strong advocate for stamping out the stigma of mental illness. She cares deeply and works tirelessly for those struggling with addictions and is an expert on this critical subject. She is a friend to all. You know, one of the things I would have to say, kind of like a little side product of being a volunteer in NAMI, and not something that you go there for or even think it's going to happen, but you have the opportunity really to get to know some remarkable people. And Natalie is one of those at the top of my list because Natalie has been a friend for me and supported me through a very difficult time in my life. And I know that she has helped so many other people. And we thank you, Natalie, and we appreciate all the things that you do for those in our community. And so with that, I'm turning it over to Natalie and looking forward to what we're all going to learn and benefit from tonight. So thank you, Natalie, from the bottom of my heart. You're the best girl.
You're welcome. All righty. Yay! It's Thursday night, which happens to be my Friday, so I'm super excited. Thank you to everybody who showed up tonight. I do hope to share to the best of my ability. I do want to be clear that if you are a professional on here, you may know more than me, and that's okay because maybe you can teach me as well. But it is my intention to share as much as I know about a subject that I do feel very strongly about. I have had the opportunity to present this same presentation to a group of family members at a facility that I currently work at here in town called the River Source. We have an inpatient facility out in the middle of the desert, and then also we have an outpatient facility in Gilbert. So our family group got a chance to hear this on Tuesday night. And one of the people that is here today is one of those family members, but it was in Nebraska and wasn't able to make Tuesday night. So she slipped in here so she gets to learn a little bit about NAMI, and she also gets to hear me. So that's really cool. For those of you who are friends, it's really great to see a familiar face. And for those of you who I don't recognize, welcome. I hope that you truly do walk away with more information than you have right now. So I am going to share a PowerPoint with you, and I'm going to load her up right now. Play from the start. Here we go. So I need to make sure, can you all see this? Whoa. I need to make sure I can see you though. What happened here? Screen share. I only make a living doing this right now with Zooming. Thank you for your patience. Okay, now I get to see you and I get to see the presentation. So I entitled this Addiction Alcohol 101, and next week is going to be Addiction Drug 101. And I am here as a representative of the NAMI Valley of the Sun Board of Directors. For those of you who don't know this, I am also a family member who has dealt with mental illness and addiction in my own personal family. I took my first family to family class in 2008. I learned so much. And yes, I am a mental health professional, but just like anything, when this stuff hits close to home, everything I knew or thought I knew went out the window, and I really needed some support and some information from people who really knew what they were talking about. And as a result of that class that I took in 2008, I then have volunteered ever since then. And I see that kind of as a lifetime commitment going forward. And we're always looking for volunteers. So that being said, we'll move forward. Well, addictions is a really interesting topic because we think of it as alcohol and drugs, but it honestly is so many more things than that. And there are also 12-step support groups for many of those things as well. I have heard, I have not actually documented all of them, but I have heard that there's 30 some addictions out there, and I'm not at all surprised by that. So what we have to be careful when we're working with people who are in addiction is that when they go and get treatment, that they don't switch from one to the other. And that's the reason I wanted to put this slide up, just to give you an idea that people do that. It's not uncommon, it is very common. Because at the core, it's still the core issue of why someone is using. Some of those that we see that are very common switch addictions are gambling, internet, and gaming, sex and eating, shopping, exercising, and pornography. Now, the interesting one is eating, because somebody who has an eating disorder cannot just stop eating. So that is a very different kind of addiction to work with, and that's much more about moderation. You can also see that some people can engage in some of these behaviors and or substances and it doesn't bother them, and yet others who it does deeply. But we are going to talk about alcohol. And so some things I want to share about alcohol is that we know when an individual drinks alcohol, it goes into their blood system and their bloodstream, and then it goes into their brain and rapidly from the stomach. When this happens, the alcohol is slowing down the messages to and from the brain, and that's where you get that slower response time from. Now, I would suggest that there are probably more females on this this Zoom meeting tonight than there are males. So it's an interesting point that if you were to put a male and a female side by side, and they drank the same amount, the female would score twice that of the BAC than the male, because women have more fat and less water, and men have more water and less fat. And therefore, in men, it becomes diluted more. Just a small little tidbit there. All right, I'm going to give you some history because this fascinates me a lot. Back in 1956, people who were working with addiction at that time kind of saw it as that being sick or having the illness. And that was kind of what it was. And then in 1987, the American Medical Association decided that, we kind of think that possibly there's something physically going on here and the brain is being affected. And because an organ is being affected, therefore it's not functioning as well as it was. So that's more when the disease model became into effect, 1987. Then it was in 2013 that a really big shift happened, and that's where the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, which is that psychiatric Bible in the sky that those of us in mental health industry use frequently, many times a day. But then they identified that it was a mental illness and that it was a chronic brain disorder, which helped significantly in terms of trying to address addiction from many different levels. So we've gone from what used to be kind of called as a characterological defect all the way to a disease of an organ to a mental illness and chronic brain disorder. So I want you just to kind of know some of that. Currently, and names change. So currently, substance use disorder, also known as SUD in the industry, is the definition, according to the American Psychiatric Association, is a brain disease that is manifested by compulsive substance use despite harmful consequences. So we're going to talk about that coming up. Then let's go back up to addiction, because this definition is, you can almost break it down into parts. It's a complex disease. Addiction is not simple. And the people who deal with addiction are not simple people. Now, the treatment can be very simple if people would just follow what is recommended, but oftentimes, because we are human, because we are talking about a brain disorder, it's just not that simple of a process. But it's a complex disease of the brain and the body. It involves compulsion use of one or more substances. And again, we get this thing, despite serious health and social consequences. We come back to that, which is so perplexing, because if you're a family member, you're wondering, why does my family member continue to do this? It doesn't make sense. I'm going to kind of cut this down into different areas. One is the phases of addiction, but also the accompanying intervention. So if you were, so to speak, watching this Zoom meeting and you were to say, well, I might have a problem, you might look at those phases. If you're a family member, you might look more so on the intervention side. But many people, and especially young people, they start with this experimental phase. And what we know is this is where we put things in place like the old DARE program, but alcohol and drug education. And for some, that works. For not, we have the next up, which is social and recreationally. And for these kinds of, this might be kids that are learning and kind of, they're practicing more, they're practicing with multiple drugs, and they're getting a little bit more comfortable with it. And then the intervention is some of that same alcohol and drug education, but more some harm minimization information. This might be where somebody who is that person's age group, who is dealing with that kind of addiction, might come and share their story at a high school or a middle school or something of that sort. And then, of course, counseling. This is oftentimes where maybe somebody has gotten arrested for the first time and they're recommended that they go to diversion program. That might fall into this category as well. What's important to, and very difficult to discern, is that many individuals use recreationally for a lifetime, but they don't become addicted. And it's perplexing. But some become addicted on that very first use of a substance. There are some substances that are much more addictive than others, methamphetamines and heroin and even alcohol. So if you were to take a room full of alcoholics and ask them, did you know from the very first time that you tried that you were going to like this, and this is something you really wanted to continue to do regardless of what was going on in your life because it felt good? You're going to get a high percentage of people saying, well, I wouldn't have done it then, but if I look back, I would have said that. The next one is harmful dependence, daily preoccupation. You think about it throughout the day, on your way to work, on your way home from work, while you're studying, while you're watching TV, while you're cooking. And then these folks oftentimes need additional care and intervention. So it could be medical in nature, support groups, counseling. And this is when we start looking at professional treatment recommendations. So for the persons here that might not know what some of the terminology is in this area, people who go to treatment might stay there, like be a resident, and we call that residential or inpatient treatment. Then they might graduate to something called PHP, primary hospitalization. Both of those are considered medical programs. So during this COVID, many of those organizations stayed open because it's of medical need. And then you move into the IOP, which is the intensive outpatient, and then maybe a GOP or a general outpatient counseling. And then maybe you might graduate on to a support group or a 12-step program. So that kind of gives you the lay of the land in terms of the options. But all of those are options right around harmful dependence and daily preoccupation. And then we have the full-blown addiction, which is where using becomes necessary to feel normal. And all of those things are part of that addiction process and intervention. So, why do people drink? Another fascinating question to ask a group of people who are trying to get sober. And that is, well, I drink because it's socially acceptable. It could be peer pressure. Many of the individuals that I am currently working with in the facility, they are, I want to say, 18 to 60. We do have some that are older than that, but I'm going to say in terms of general. So there's some common themes that came up that I might share with you as a group. Now, they are going to be representative in most facilities, most places that are dealing with addiction. Ours is not unique. But, oftentimes the peer pressure becomes the invitation, but the feelings of guilt and shame and just, you can't even imagine, disappointing a family or loved ones again. So these broken family relationships and the loss of control and their feeling of dignity and self-esteem and self-love is just, it's absent. So that is also a reason. So it can be like a positive thing, like, oh, I felt kind of peer pressure, we were having fun, or it can be, I am broken. I am broken, I don't know how to function. I don't have any hope. It can be used to cope with stress and conflict and illness, and it is definitely used to manage mental health symptoms. We know that there is definitely a connection here. We will talk more about that later today. Also, it can initially feel good, and then it can absolutely lead to where one feels just absolutely no hope. There is no spiritual sense of oneself, and actually just kind of like, where are you, God, if you believe in God, kind of thing. Addiction is really good about taking you out of where you're currently at and thinking about anything but that. So that is also another thing. And then it can be helpful, without more medical information. So I don't want to speak out of term here, but many people who start to drink and then become dependent on drinking are using it to kind of help with the physical manifestation of not being able to sleep or wanting to numb out. They don't have a desire to live, or they just are looking for some courage, like liquid courage or confidence to accomplish something. So it's right about here, I just want to share that I come from a family of addicts. Some got treated and some did not. And also I found it very quick that I also started to experience signs and symptoms of addiction. And I'm here to share with you that I now have 10 years of sobriety from alcoholism. And I was a later in life drinker, so I didn't really start until 45 because I came from this perspective that I would never, ever be as sick as my family. That was my theory, never, ever. But see, there were so many other factors going on here. It wasn't just, I couldn't will myself out of that. So really it was between 45 and 50 that I was drinking. So the note I want to share here is that when women tend to start later in life in drinking, they go down fast. And that was my experience. And if you were to ask me, why did I drink? And mine would be probably is that this one right here. It redirected my thinking away from whatever the problem was of the day. It also was about numbing out. And I was a pretty accomplished professional, and so I also used it to reward myself. Ugh. There are 3 causal theories I wanted to share. And I also wanted to take a moment and say, I'm happy to answer questions, but if you all could just let me continue to get through, it's about 35 minutes, then possibly I can answer your question. But it helps me if we could do that. So I appreciate your patience with that. One causal theory is this choice model, and some people do believe in the choice model, and I'm not here to dispute any one of them. And it comes from a theory of an addict makes a choice to use, and therefore they can choose to quit. Pull them up by their bootstraps, that kind of thing. This also is the model that was kind of the basis for coming up with a consequential theories. So if you drink, or if you get a DUI, or you do something under the influence, the consequence of having to go to jail or prison. The next one is the disease model. And again, this was back in 1987 when the American Medical Association kind of adopted addiction as part of the disease model. Well, it was because, again, it was about an organ of the body, and in this case, the brain. But let's use a different organ as an example. So if I break my femur, I'm going to have pain and swelling, and those are the symptoms. If I have addiction, I'm affecting my brain, and my brain's not thinking, not making good choices. The chemicals aren't working correctly. Next thing I know is I'm making emotional decisions, not cognitive decisions, or problem solving or decision making is out the window. Because I can tell you for a fact, some of the things that I did during my active addiction defy explanation as a professional, intelligent woman. And so when we're talking about the brain, we talk about a defective reward system. One of the chemicals in the brain is called dopamine. Dopamine is your feel-good chemical in the brain. And so what happens is when people use, it dumps this chemical dopamine in the brain. And initially it's great. And then it stops working. And that's what happened with me, is that I could not get enough alcohol in my body to achieve the same effect. But this is where people experience loss of control, and the consequences are basically null and void. And then there's the between theory. And this is where addicts may make that original choice to pick up and use. I buy that. But this is influenced by a couple other things, for example, by genetics and environmental factors. And so I'm again going to use myself. I don't mind using myself because it sometimes kind of puts a face with an experiment, an experience. And if it makes sense to you, then I'm glad I did it. If it doesn't, just totally disregard. But so when we talk about a genetic, remembering back to when I shared that I come from a family of addicts, honestly, my mom, my dad, my brother, the whole line of gentlemen on my dad's side. And then there were some other issues, mental health related, on my mom's side. And it was just a cluster of challenges for me. No surprise I got into the mental health industry to figure out what was going on with them. And then with me. And I think that was part of my motivation. And then there's environmental facts. And so this could be things like childhood trauma. And we will talk more about that, but it can also be other kinds of environmental factors, which our environment is bombarding us with things that are very difficult for us to manage. And with technology, this is becoming even more. And so this is a very real thing. So between the actual addiction, genetic, environmental, this is really the theory that I prescribe to the most. But again, not one of them is right or wrong. And depending on individuals coming to get treatment for their addiction, presuming they're interested, because that's the number one thing. They have to be interested. Otherwise, it's really tough to make progress there. But in a very short period of time, when it reaches a stage, the same individual who initially made a choice but had all those other factors is no longer capable of making a choice, and that's when we have the illness. We also have, hang on a second, trauma and addiction. I like this slide. I add this slide because it's important that, like addiction affects the brain, trauma affects the brain as well. So what exactly does trauma do? Well, trauma can actually change the physical composure of the brain. It does. It actually affects the brain structure. It also lowers our emotional control. It lowers our ability to learn. And it also lowers our ability to change our behavior. So there's a very famous study scale assessment tool that I do use often with clients, and it's called the ACEs, which is the Adverse Childhood Experiences Scale. And basically you're asking 10 questions of, have you experienced any one of these events between 0 and 18? And then dependent on your score, it's very predictive for things. For example, it's incredibly predictive for outcome measures for physical illness later in life, because again, trauma affects the body. The other is that it also is highly correlated with addiction rates and also mental health rates. So back to this particular slide, these kinds of things together, trauma and addiction, is another perfect storm. So if addiction were to just kind of go like this, but if you were to add trauma to it, it would definitely go up like this in terms of it actually increases the significance of the signs and symptoms and development of addiction. Now the question is, well, what's a trauma? Because what's a trauma to you might not be a trauma to me, or what used to be might not be in the future, because we live in an ever-changing world. But typically, these are what are used for the experiences. So we have being in a life-threatening situation. Now this one's interesting. You don't have to experience it. You can witness a life-threatening situation. Now, for a moment, I want you to wrap your brain around that, because think of all the people who are dealing with our COVID patients. They are actually witnessing life-threatening situations, and oftentimes doing it alone and isolated with them. Continuous exposure to dangerous situations, and then also witnessing death and dying. People will begin to use drugs and alcohol after a trauma about 76% of the time. Now, where this is coming from and why I feel important about this is that for 20 years I worked in the law enforcement field, and I worked with a lot of victims of person crimes. So that's going to be your domestic violence, your sexual assaults, child abuse, elder abuse, assaults, aggravated assault, things like that. And this is what I found not only in the research, but through my personal and professional experience, is that it becomes a great medicator when dealing with trauma. And then when we have prolonged trauma, these are for certain professions, and this is also ever growing. I have a strong affection, obviously, for first responders, so police, fire, EMTs, Border Patrol, Department of Corrections, those kind of things. But the other one is the children who grow up in families where they have abuse and neglect and abandonment. So back to that scale that I was talking about, that ACEs scale, I have taken the test myself on multiple times, and I use it as a tool when I'm talking with people or groups of people who are taking the test, because there's a message in this, and that is that the score of 4 out of 10 is where we start to see some change in terms of outcome measures. My score is 8 out of 10. Now, 8 out of 10, and you might go, well, I wonder, like, what's the potential for somebody who rates an 8 out of 10 to actually be a qualified professional later on in life, a healthy individual, somebody who can actually turn around and help other people? And I'm here to tell you that can happen. And also, I wanted to share with you that you might think that it's the abuse that is the heart-wrenching part of an ACEs scale. But also remember, it includes neglect and abandonment, and that's where I got my scores from. So just knowing that oftentimes it's not the physical, it is the emotional and spiritual trauma that we as people and children experience that can create these prolonged exposures. There's some other things here that are listed. Now we're going to kind of move. I thought it was appropriate to include addiction plus mental illness just a little bit, because it is NAMI, and we call this co-occurring or dual diagnosis. So if you hear those terms, that's what that means. And oftentimes people who have mental illness, they obviously don't feel comfortable with them. Some of the signs and symptoms, they don't understand them. They feel very scary. No one sat down and said this is possibly what's going on, and so it's not uncommon for people to start self-medicating. So there's 3. Oops, I made a mistake. I meant to add depression here too, so we'll just pretend that it's there and we'll talk about it as if it is. but people start to self-medicate their experiences. So let's take the one bipolar. Just imagine for a moment that your moods are up and down and in and out, and you have absolutely no control over the mania or the depressive piece, and don't understand why and how this is happening to you, or you are having some sort of psychotic episode with it, meaning you're hearing things and seeing things that aren't there. Can be incredibly alarming. And then again, most of the time, this is happening for an individual who's having a first episode between the ages of 18 and 28, 30, that type of thing, maybe even 26. So it can be very alarming. And yeah, it makes total sense. I don't want to feel that. I want to numb out. I want to find a way to manage that because that's super uncomfortable. Also with anxiety, I would say that 80% of the patients that I have right now dealing with addiction treatment also have co-occurring disorders of any one of these three: depression, bipolar, or anxiety. And anxiety is probably the one most. And then when we think about anxiety and depression, we know, what is it? Is anxiety causing the depression, or is it depression causing the anxiety? So they're very commingled anyway. But if you were to look at the statistics, it's saying that anxiety and mood disorders are 2 to 3 times more likely to have substance use disorders. All right, so this slide comes with a couple different perspectives as well. So I use this chart, the stages of change, every day, multiple times a day with the people that I work with, because what we're trying to do is assess where they're at on this. If they're not committed to treatment, they don't really think they have a problem, they've had a few consequences, they're down here in pre-contemplation stage, and they're probably not in treatment unless they were forced to do so. But in any event, if you're a family member, I want to give you the other part of this step, even though it's not on here, so I will share that. But when you're a family member of somebody in the pre-contemplation stage where they are unaware of the problem, this is where you stay in contact. You just stay in contact because contact is information and intel. You also raise their awareness and kind of go, wow, I noticed that, or I see that. You also stop, S-T-O-P, stop enabling an individual at this point. Also, you allow them to experience some consequences. So oftentimes you're going to see down here, this is going to be your adolescent or your early adulthood area. But not always, okay? We have some pretty crafty people who are middle-aged and elderly who have gotten along for a long time, just being known as the eccentric aunt or uncle that may be using a lot, and also probably having some untreated, undiagnosed mental health issues. But bottom line is, that's what your job as a family is, to pay attention and kind of bring some awareness to them. The next one is the contemplation stage. And this is where the person who's thinking, I might have a problem, and I'm curious about what it would take for me to get better. And as a family member, what you want to do here is you want to do a cost-benefit analysis, in your own personal way and non-threatening way. You also want to be non-threatening down here. You're just noticing here. You're kind of increasing the ante here as in the contemplation stage. But as they're going up, your response is going up differently. And then we have the preparation phase, which is where the individual intends to take action. So this is usually, they might be entering into a 12-step program here. They might be all the way to going into a treatment program. That's usually where we see people right there. And so for a family member, what we recommend here is get involved. If they have a family group or a family night or something like this, go learn, be a part of it. Also recommending is there are different kinds of 12-step programs for families. One of them notably as Al-Anon, but there is also another program called parents of addicted loved ones. That's another one. And there are other ones that are out there that are in other programs. Even Smart Recovery has a component for the family. So there are options out there. Please don't let somebody tell you there are no options for families, because there are. And it is the number one recommendation right here at the preparation phase. Also learn what they're experiencing, learn about this chart so that you know and can have the same language that they're having. When they take the action phase in this section, they're probably getting some support and some professional assistance. They're also being asked to do things like go to a 12-step meeting, get a sponsor, go to meetings, do the steps, do the assignments. I mean, there's lots of action. I've had people try and tell me that this is a full-time job, but you know what, for them, it really is. It's a full-time job not to take the next drink. Wake up sober, go to bed sober. So they do see it as a full-time job. And again, your job as a family member is to just have regular contact, encourage the progress they're making. So you kind of make it attractive to continue with the treatment, and you make it unattractive to want to bail. That's what you want to do. And then the last one here is that maintenance stage. And this is where people are starting to feel like, maybe I can do this. Maybe there are some benefits here. I kind of like this thing where I'm not getting in trouble all the time, and I'm not having to put a lot of money and attention into staying clean and sober. And this is where family members also get very excited. Okay, this is best case scenario, folks. Best case scenario. My name is also Natalie, a realist. Two things. The reality that people are going to maintain a clean and sober lifestyle is 10%. Super discouraging if you're a family member, and super discouraging if you're paying for treatment. But the reality is that people who come into treatment for the first time, it's 10%. So have realistic expectations for your loved one. The other is that this takes a lot of energy to maintain. Ongoing meetings, ongoing events with your sponsor or whomever program. There's another program out there called Recovery Dharma, more so Buddhist based, and it's based on some other principles that, you know, if you were kind of open-minded, you'd see where they overlap. And instead of having a sponsor, you have what is called a wise friend. And so there's still that support mechanism there. But the second thing I want you to know is that I would like to say that it's a clean arrow that goes up like this, and oftentimes it's not. So people come up, they go back down. They come up and they go back down, and they go up and they come back down. But guess what? So do family members. So you're learning as a family member to do new and groovy things to kind of help support your family member, but you too might make progress and also slide and make progress and slide. That's why the support system is so important, and to not feel alone in this time, because when you feel alone, whether you're the addict or the loved one, you're probably going to go back to some behaviors like enabling, rescuing, things like that, because it feels comfortable. And in any crisis situation, I've been doing crisis work for 20 years. I know that in a crisis, we naturally, because we're humans, rely on our least helpful coping skill when there's a crisis. We automatically go to something that's maybe not the best thing to do. We're easily, with support, able to get back on track, which is why a support system is so helpful. All right. I'm almost done. This is the second to last slide. When we start to see addiction as a disease, we can start to treat it medically. One of the things that is out there, I'm checking my time. Oh, okay, I'm not doing so great, but that's okay. Is that when we start to treat it medically rather than legally, we can talk some more about diversion programs. There are some programs that are known for what we call MAT programs, M-A-T, medically assisted treatment, where you use one medication to kind of help with the addiction, to kind of wean them off. And there's some mimicking of symptoms and treatment that happened there. You do need medical intervention when you're doing that. I'm not here to say good, bad. There's lots of opinions about it. It does work very well for some people. An old one that's out there, Antabuse, you might have heard of that, is one of those that people take. And if you go ahead and you ingest any alcohol content, it makes you very sick. So I just had a patient who had red wine vinaigrette, must have had a lot, but had red wine vinaigrette on a salad on Monday, and had actually a significant experience of medical discomfort, physical discomfort because of that drug and abuse. So it does work. It's not very pleasant. So the other one is that there are some states that are moving towards court-ordered treatment for rather than incarceration. We're so far behind the 8 ball here, but there are some programs that are doing it. There's a fabulous judge out in Florida, Judge Leeper, something of that court. He is a wonderful advocate for putting treatment rather than incarceration. And there's a local group of people called Under David's Hope. They are a nonprofit organization, and they've worked very hard to work with our court systems in every single county in Arizona to move forward in this way. There are some medical interventions I talked about, MAP program, and we now know that an integrated model of care is the way to go almost in anything, including addiction. So it's not uncommon for a staffing to include doctor, therapists like me, a MAT person, a naturopath person, a case manager, a BHD. I mean, several people come around the table with the client and their family to talk about what's the next best step. So that's the treatment. This is my contact information. I'm willing to share it with anybody who wants it. I'm doing way too much right now, but I'm here as a NAMI Valley of the board member. And so I'm going to go ahead and remove that and stop sharing my screen, stop share. And I'm back here. I would love to answer questions if there are any. If you have a question that you'd like to offer up on the chat, that may be Marissa's my sidekick today. She can help me with. So anyway, thank you. Thank you. I'm open for questions. Is that how this works?
Yeah, so you guys can unmute yourselves. There's a toolbar down at the bottom, and it has a microphone. You click that, you can unmute yourself and ask any questions, or if you don't feel comfortable talking, you can put it into the chat and I'll read them off to Natalie.
Cool. Natalie, for someone who is in denial and you want to do something to help the person, but they're not accepting of any of the stages that you mentioned the first one. Mm-hmm. But what can family members do if they're not?
Yeah, this is the toughest part right here. This and people who progress and then relapse. Those are the two areas that I find family members struggle the most with. But it's important to not give up hope. And so staying in contact, documenting, keeping notes. You're not going to throw it in the family member's face. I'm not suggesting that. But what I'm saying is, as a family member, after a while, you start to feel like you're crazy because, like, I swear this is happening, and yet they're denying it. Okay. So if you can do that, it's very helpful. And then also, just being loving. And as one of the sayings in Al-Anon is to detach with love. And I have done this with my own family members. I did it with my mother as well. I was kind of a sandwich individual where I just really had a hard time with those boundaries and setting limits. And sometimes when we set limits for all the right reasons, there are things that happen that we didn't intention. And, that did happen for me with my mother. But just like mental illness, when we want to be there to kind of help that person get to that space of more awareness, is that we just continue to love them until they can figure out that they really need it or that they are open to that. It's not something you can force.
Thank you.
Natalie, if someone has an addiction in one thing, maybe alcohol, are they apt to have more addictions? Is that the person who goes from addiction to addiction once they start?
I can tell you, going backwards, that people either have one addiction, this is my own personal experience, one addiction or multiple addictions. And so we're talking about behavior, and we're talking about a substance. So it's also different, because if I'm a sex addict, that's a behavior, not a substance. I know it's a behavior. So, and that kind of comes together a lot. It's about one's thinking. Addiction is an addictive thinking. No different than, and I'm not making a comparison here, but people who are incarcerated for long periods of time have what we call criminal thinking. It's an adaptive thinking that helps them survive their environment. Can it be addressed? Yes, but it's difficult, because when we get into our head, it's amazing what that little knucker can do up there. So yes, the answer is that.
Yeah, okay, thank
Yeah.
you. This has been very,
Natalie?
very interesting.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Natalie, hi.
Hi.
That's when I met you in 2007 when my son became mentally ill.
Oh, hi.
Oh yeah, it's Kathy. I don't know if you can see me. I just want to say it's great to hear this information again. I'm familiar with AA and Al-Anon and OA and Debtors Anonymous, and so they all kind of lead into other as awareness has come up. But I do want to say about the enabling, I think I was just very, very fortunate to get into NAMI. As soon as I knew, or someone said Jimmy had mental illness, because it was someone in Al-Anon gave me a folder, and then I was in your class. And I think it was very hard to figure out what's enabling and what's not enabling between an alcoholic and a mental illness. Jimmy just celebrated 8 years sober, and that was his last hospitalization, July 8th, 8 years ago. And I did, like I had to call the police one time, never believed I would, but asked for a mentally health trained police officer. So I think getting this information out to people is one of the biggest things. I know I wouldn't have known it. I was afraid of my son. I would have called the police for my protection. It was very threatening. It's very scary, a psychotic episode.
Mm-hmm.
But because of NAMI and hearing that, I specifically asked for that officer. And now Jimmy shares with the police department about how the police treated him, and he remembers it so well. So I have to stay involved in, because it's one day at a time. He's doing great, but we've had mental illness, we have alcoholism in the family. So I try to stay close to all the available information and help out when I can. But it is great to hear you and see you again, because I'm remembering when you shared the class, and when you just said, "Oh, I got to check my time." I'm like, "Oh, she did that when we were in class 8 years ago too." Anyway, thanks a lot. And it's good to see others here that I know too. So thanks, Natalie.
Cool. And that's an indication, because when you get someone who's dealing with addiction and mental health, and they're young and they're males, because we all know that males mature much slower than women do. This is the perfect trifecta. And to hear that somebody is doing so well and now able to give back to the community, wow. And I've heard Jimmy speak to officers before, and they impress the pants off of him. We have to remain hopeful, but realistic.
So in the chat, there's a bunch of thank yous for this presentation from multiple people. Is there any other questions that anyone has? You can unmute yourselves like we said, or put it into the chat.
Natalie, during COVID, you work with specifically in this area. Is there an increase in, I mean, I've read some things, but I mean, what are you seeing as far as more people drinking more, more issues with this? Are they staying about the same or what?
Well, that's an interesting question, because logically it would tell us that there's more people at home that are drinking more. And there are some studies that are out there that are in fact suggesting that. It's weird though in treatment, because as people have been furloughed or lost their job, they have lost their insurance. And so it's also more difficult for them to get into treatment. So I'm not seeing those particular people in treatment. Now, I suspect that as we start to come out of this and our employment rate goes up, that there will be some more people that have either relapsed during this period, or people that didn't think they had a problem, maybe even didn't have a problem, but found themselves isolated at home and able to drink, and that became part of a kind of a daily event that developed a program. So I think the proof is going to be in the pudding going forward. I can't say that right now based on what I'm getting at work. However, there are lots of studies out there that says that alcohol is up like 35%, alcohol sales are, and for Pete's sakes, you can have it delivered to you, you know, whether it's from a restaurant or the grocery store or whatever. So it's like super easy to get. That's the other thing that I want to just take a quick moment to share, is that many of us who are family members of addicts are in somewhat denial and naive at how easy it is to get drugs of all kinds. It's like I could throw a stone in my neighborhood and I'm going to hit my next fix. That's how available and accessible it is to us as citizens. It is very, and oftentimes it's the people you have no clue.
Natalie, I wanted to say one more thing. When you mentioned the nurses, my daughter's a crisis nurse in New Jersey during the COVID thing, and she's a nurse here, but she got stranded back there. And what is happening now is mental illness is showing up with the admission of a COVID patient, and they can't have family members with them. And she had one, and she's been through NAMI, and she has the experience of her brother. So she was a little bit more equipped, but the girl was having a psychotic break, but the nurses are so covered up, they look like robots. Mm-hmm. And so the girl wanted to touch someone's skin. She's a young woman I think in her late 20s. And my daughter was like, because they're not supposed to take their gloves off, and the parents are in the lobby, but she chose to take her glove off, wash her hands, take her glove off, and let the girl hold her hand. And then went down and talked to the mother and assured the mother that they would take good care of her daughter. Because that was one of the scariest points, was when Jimmy got psychotic and they took him off into the UPC, we couldn't go back there with him. And you don't know what's going on, but she's been through a lot. She held the hands of several people that were with gloves on, several people that passed away in New Jersey. This is in New Jersey and New York. So when you brought that up, the nurses are being counseled on that their skin is breaking down, the mental illness is coming in, people are thrashing because they can't see their families or see their cell phones. So it's going to be, I think, it's going to show up even more as time goes on. But I'm glad you brought that up. Not that I worry about her.
Yes, you do, Mom.
Yeah, you're right.
Well, I know that we're at the end, and I just want to have a little closing statement, and that is that, most of us are doing the best that we can. And those who are dealing with addiction and mental health are doing the best that they can as well. And I'm a firm believer of just loving and the detaching with love, and letting go, and letting something bigger than us also allow that space for them to come in. Oftentimes, we as well-meaning family members kind of step in thinking we're helping, but we're not helping. And people who are in addiction and in mental health signs and symptoms need to feel competent at something. They need to feel success at something. So to reward that. One of my greatest studies when I was in graduate school was a project that I was part of. It was called Catch 'em Being Good. It was a parenting program for kids who were going through divorced families. And I parented my kids that way, which was every time they did good things, I would support that. And when they did negative things, I would not necessarily overlook it, but I wouldn't pay attention to it as much. And so I think the same thing can be happening here, is that we support the positive changes and choices that our family members are making. I can't thank you enough for coming, being a part of this. I will be back next week for drugs. If you want to learn more about drugs, I don't have any, but I know about them.
Thank you so much, Natalie. Thank you so much for joining us this Thursday.
Yes.
Couple Thursdays.
Thank you.
All right.
Good night, all.
Bye.
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 Bye.